Hello, everyone. I'm your People Behind the Science podcast host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and I am thrilled to be welcoming you to episode 618 of our show today. In this episode, we're going to be chatting with our guest researcher, Dr. Gabriella Vigliocco, and I'm glad to have you all here for our interview today. But if you want to continue meeting fantastic scientists through our show, you can follow us on Twitter at PBT Science, and I'm at PhD Marie. And today, Gabriella is going to share some of her own experiences in her life, her career, and her research. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our exceptional people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Gabriella Vigliocco. So, Gabriella, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm very good, and thank you very much for having me, dear.
Well, we are so excited to learn more about you and the wonderful work you do. But before we dive into the details, let me take a moment here to tell our listeners a little bit more about you and your background. So listeners, Gabriella is professor of psychology and language sciences in the Department of Experimental Psychology at University College London. There, she is also director of the Cognition and Language Learning Laboratory and director of the Leverhulme Doctoral Training Programme in the Ecological Study of the Brain. In addition, Gabriella is a scientist in residence at the Moss Rehabilitation Research Institute in Philadelphia. Gabriella completed her Bachelor of Science degree at Padua University in Rome and her Ph.D. degree at the University of Trieste in Italy. Afterwards, she conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Arizona. And before joining the faculty at UCL, Gabriella served as a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin and a visiting scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. Throughout her career, Gabriella has received various awards and honors, including being awarded a Royal Society Wolfson Research Merit Award, being named a Fellow of the Cognitive Science Society, and being named a Fellow of the Association for Psychological Sciences as well. Today, Gabriella, we're excited to get to know you both as a scientist and in general as a person. So can you start by telling us more about what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Well, I spend a lot of time playing mom for my wonderful 15-year-old son.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, I love to cook for the family and for friends. I mainly cook the Italian way, and pasta is an all-time favorite dish in my household, for example. But in the years, I've also created a variety of fusion-type dishes, bringing in ingredients and recipes from all over the world, and in particular from Japanese, Chinese, Spanish, French, and Polish cuisine. And this is because I've had the opportunity to cook with a number of colleagues who are amazing cooks themselves. And it looks like a lot of scientists actually enjoy making and eating good food. And these people are coming from different countries. So I've learned new tricks. And in this way, my cuisine is turning into a real fusion type. Also, I like to read, and I've always been an avid consumer of science fiction and fantasy since I was a teen. And more recently, because my son has a talent for music, I've also discovered the pleasure to go to classical music concerts. And being in London, I'm pretty much spoiled for choice, as there is no shortage of amazing concerts around.
That is phenomenal. Gabriella, it sounds like you have a wide variety of hobbies and things that you like to do. I'd love to dive into books next. You mentioned you're a sci-fi and fantasy enthusiast. Do you have a particular book recommendation for me and our listeners out there, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, or perhaps more scientific oriented?
I do, actually. So I would recommend a novel that is called The Shadow of the Wind. This is a story in a story about a 10-year-old boy who picks up a book from an author and gets interested in this author, but this author seems to have disappeared from the face of Earth. The novel is about the other books written by this mysterious author and what happened to him. The author is Carlos Luis Zafón, a Spanish contemporary writer. And the story is set in a semi-fictional Barcelona, which is full of tiny alleys which are hiding from view really spectacular villas. And each villa has its own quirky secrets and so forth. I really enjoyed reading it. May I recommend a second book, by the way?
Oh, sure.
And this is something related to science. This is The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee. This is an amazing journey into genetics from its beginnings to today, going over the milestones that have been achieved in the field, but also going through the main failures in research that have occurred. I also like very much the human way in which the authors talk about the field and the implications of genetic findings for ethics, for example, or starting in history, so a consequence like eugenics. So I thought in general is a multi-level science book that has a human part. And so this makes it really appealing in my mind.
Oh, I love it. Well, Gabriella, I've read The Gene myself and can second that recommendation. And I look forward to picking up the first book you mentioned. So listeners, we will put these on our website for you to find there as well. And I'd love to dive into your scientific side because you do fascinating research there in the lab. So Gabriella, for people who maybe aren't familiar with your research specifically or your field more generally, how do you describe what you do?
I study how people use language, how children learn it, and how adults use language, and the brain's underpinnings of this human ability. Our ability to use language is really at the core of so much of what we do. In education, we learn because someone is explaining things to us. Communications allow us to cooperate and collaborate in a variety of different ways. And in general, it guides our most complex behaviors. Language comes in various shapes and forms, including spoken and sign. But in all cases, what it does is to allow us to share experiences that happened in the past. It allows us to envision the future and also to create and explore imaginary worlds, fantasy worlds. So the general guiding question of my work is, how does this work? How does the brain make this possible? More specific questions I have addressed throughout my career have been how disability comes about in childhood and how children and adults develop mental representations starting from language and how disabilities break down after brain damage, as well as, of course, how the brain manages all that. I'm quite eclectic in my methods. In fact, I use methods from psychology, from neuroscience, and from computational modeling. And what I try to do for each question is try to look at it from different perspectives, considering different languages being spoken or signed, and also looking at different populations. Indeed, I mentioned adults, I mentioned children, I'm looking at deaf individuals who use sign language, and also people with aphasia.
Excellent. Well, Gabriella, I'm looking forward to getting into some of the details of these projects that you've been working on. But I'd love to start by talking a little bit more about motivation. I think studying language, studying anything really in humans can be quite difficult. So there are some tough days. You got to keep yourself motivated and inspired. So how do you do it? Do you have a particular quote or a saying that really keeps you going?
I don't know about the specific motivational quote. There is a quote from an American physicist, Frederick Seitz, who I think describes me and describes what keeps me going. And here it is. A good scientist is a person in whom the childhood quality of perennial curiosity lingers on. Once he gets an answer, he asks other questions. And I guess to me, what keeps me going is the fact that I continue to have questions. We get an answer, but that's just a piece of the puzzle. There's immediately the next step in front of my eyes, and that's where we need to go.
Oh, I love that. I think as a scientist, you're absolutely right. There's sort of always more you can learn, more you still don't know. So I think that is phenomenal. And I think having these people that you look up to, whether it's other scientists in your field, whether it's these historical role models, can really help people get to where they are in their scientific career. So when you think back, Gabriella, are there particular people who really stick out in your mind who served as these role models or these mentors or these people that really helped you get through your career path?
I think I've been very fortunate in this respect, as I've had amazing mentors, especially at the beginning of my career. First of all, Merrill Garrett, who is one of the founding fathers of cognitive science and who started the field of language production. He gave me, first of all, the opportunity to visit his lab when I was in the first year of my PhD in Trieste. he is the person who taught me how to think as a scientist, and more specifically as a cognitive scientist, and really the person who enabled my international career. Later, when I was a beginning assistant professor at UCL, Tim Shallis, who's the founder, along with Elizabeth Warrington, of the field of cognitive neuropsychology, had a crucial impact in shaping my thinking about cognition and the brain. I was also lucky enough to have had the opportunity to meet other outstanding scholars, like, for example, Eleanor Safran and Myrna Schwartz, both from the Moss Rehabilitation Research Institute. Their passion for understanding how the brain processes language and for developing more effective way to support people with aphasia, and this combined with true excellence in research, has always been so inspirational to me. And both Eleanor and Myrna in particular have been real role models for me throughout the years.
Phenomenal. It sounds like you had really important people there at these critical moments or these junctions in your career path. And I'd love to rewind back, Gabriella, and get a little bit more insight into where this path began. So when you think back, what is your earliest memory maybe of first getting excited about science or thinking about it as a career?
Not during childhood. And in fact, I started from a degree in experimental psychology from University of Padua, where I chose psychology as undergraduate, not because I had a passion for the study of brain and behavior yet, but because I wanted to leave my tiny home village at the feet of the Alps. And psychology at the time was only taught in Padua and Rome, both of which are far enough from my home village to make it impossible for me to commute. And I should mention here, we're talking about rural Italy quite a few years ago, which is very different from the US or the UK, especially now, where it is pretty much standard for every 18 years old to leave their family and go and study in some other town and live there. That was not the case at my times. When I started the course, I discovered I was just fascinated by the brain. In particular, I became more and more interested in cognitive neuropsychology, which is indeed the study of people who suffered brain damage, and as a consequence, they lose a specific cognitive function. And in this area, we look at these individuals as a model from which to understand how the brain works. And also more generally, very quickly, while I was an undergraduate, it became very clear to me that I was drawn to quantitative methods and to thinking in that logical and somewhat nerdish way that is typical of scientific research. So I specialized in experimental psychology. I then tried to find a job because I had no role model at the time with respect to indeed starting a scientific career, going for a PhD. But someone told me, well, you should also apply for a PhD. So I didn't find a job, but I was admitted into the experimental psychology PhD program in Trieste. At the time, I was very interested in developing a mechanistic understanding of speaking, but there were not very many people working on these issues in Trieste. And one day I heard Merrill Garrett was at a conference nearby, and I just managed to convince the organizer to let me sneak into the conference. And then off I went in front of this big figure in the field, just plainly asking him if I could spend a year in his lab in Tucson, Arizona. Well, he said yes.
Oh, wow.
That happened. And then from there, I moved to University of Wisconsin as assistant professor. My main research at the time was in language production with a specific focus on how speakers convert their thoughts into words. This fascination with how language relates to thinking has really characterized my whole career. Anyway, while I was in Wisconsin, my father in Italy became blind, and I just could not bear the thought of being so far away. It happened that UCL was advertising for a lectureship at the time, and here I am. I've been at UCL for more than 20 years now, in which my research has always been centered around language, although moving from a focus on language production to my current focus on the broader context of language use.
Oh, very interesting. And I mentioned in our introduction that you've also been a visiting scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. How did this opportunity come about?
It came about while I was in Wisconsin. I was invited to spend a year at the Max Planck. It seemed too good of an opportunity to let it slip through. So, of course, I went. So it happened that right before going there, I already had the offer from UCL. So in a sense, the year at the Max Planck had been my transition back to Europe in this respect. It was amazing being at the Max Planck, being along pretty much only like-minded people so interested in language and doing such a variety of different type of research, starting from field work in Oceania or various other places to very detailed neuroimaging work. It was really inspirational.
Wonderful. Well, Gabriella, I love this story that you've told us. And it sounds like a really big turning point was when you were able to sneak into this conference, which I think is amazing, and find this leader in the field and have this conversation and make that big ask. Was it intimidating for you, or did you just sort of grit your teeth and do it?
I don't know. I just did it. It was intimidating afterwards, thinking about what did I do? Oh, my goodness.
Right.
But by that point, I did it. So,
that is amazing. And I really admire that, I will say. And I know you've had this amazing path to get to where you are today, and you are working on some phenomenal research projects. We'd love to go into some detail here. So is there one in particular, Gabriella, that you are just the most excited about right now that you want to share with me and our listeners?
Well, I'm very happy to tell you that the research that at the moment, most of my lab is busy working on, which is sponsored by the European Research Council. This is a project that aims at characterizing language development and language comprehension in the real world, namely in face-to-face social interaction. The premise to this work is the observation that most of what we currently know about language and its neural substrate comes from studies in which language is studied only as speech or written text, neglecting completely that the brain has evolved its capacity to use language in face-to-face interaction, where in addition to the linguistic information carried by words, there is a large amount of additional behaviors that co-occur, like the use of gestures, which are omnipresent when we speak, the use of eye gaze, and the use of intonation, as well as the presence of mouth movements that necessarily accompany speech. Traditionally, all of these additional behaviors have been considered as adds-on that, however, do not change the way in which the brain processes language. But I'd argue that this is still an assumption that requires proper testing. So overall, we do not know when people produce this multimodal behavior, how they are timed with the speech, and how they are orchestrated, especially among conversational partners. So in our work, we started by collecting a corpus of face-to-face communication between a caregiver and their child, or between two adults. And we did this in order to characterize how these multimodal cues are used. And we've done this for English at this point, but we have also started collecting a small sample with signers. We're then carrying out behavioral and neuroscientific studies looking at how the brain responds to the presence of these cues and whether they help comprehension. And we find that, first of all, these behaviors are eminently common during communication, and that overall they are used by listeners to support comprehension and language development. In particular, our current results strongly suggest that the speakers unconsciously, for example, tend to use these multimodal cues, like, for example, the use of gesture or changing the rate at which they are speaking when they are saying something that is harder for a listener to understand. So these cues then help the listener in comprehending what the speaker is saying. For example, using a slower speaking rate gives the listener more time to process the incoming words. I'm really excited about this line of work because I think it really has the potential to change our view of language. And also, I'd like to mention that it has further branched out into a broader program of interdisciplinary research that is aiming at characterizing brain and behavior in their ecology, namely in the physical, social, and cultural contexts in which these behaviors occur in the real world. And I'm at present the lead of a PhD program that you mentioned at the beginning, the Ecological Brain Program, that brings together psychologists, neuroscientists, architects, engineers, computer scientists, and educators that are all sharing in doing research that tries to bring the laboratory to the real world, for example, using mobile technology to measure behavior and brain responses when people are out and about, or bring some of the complexity of the real world in the laboratory, using, for example, virtual or augmented reality. I think that this program of research has the potential to impact not only our basic understanding of brain and behavior, but also other disciplines. In fact, for example, if we can better understand how people interact, say, in specific buildings, for example, a train station or a conference center, we can then model how we design specific type of buildings in a way that is better suited to how our brain processes them.
Oh, this is fascinating. And Gabriella, I'm so glad you brought up this idea of the context in which we communicate. And I think for many of us, I guess the way we've been communicating over particularly the past year or two has changed quite a bit, or has been very different, shifting from a lot of in-person, kind of that real face-to-face communication to more of a pseudo face-to-face, right? Where you're communicating over video chat, things like that. Do you think that is having an impact, or what impact do you think that has?
Well, clearly, it has been having a major impact, in particular in those key situations in which there have been face-to-face communication with masks and potentially visors, where it's very, very hard to understand the speech and also understand the type of emotions that the person is expressing. And if you think about it, this has been extremely critical in so many important situations, like in hospitals, for example, also in educational settings. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that we move from face-to-face situations to pseudo-face-to-face situations. And I'd like to point out that still we have gone to face-to-face. We are not happy with just phone calls. We want to be able to see our interlocutor. That's because, indeed, there are all these different cues that matter. And also, there's emotion that we can express through the face that wouldn't be visible otherwise. Although I agree with you, it's pseudo in the sense that, first of all, we do not see the body of a speaker when we are interacting over Zoom. But we tend to see, or even worse, something like FaceTime, we only see the face of the speaker. And gestures are so important during communication. And in fact, I always advise people to sit a little further away from the screen so that people can see their hands as well and use gesture. They are important for turn taking. They are important for also supporting the meanings that are being expressed. For example, people can make gestures that are iconic of what they are saying. And also another issue that may occur, and it would be very interesting to do additional research, is the fact that communication can break down over Zoom, not just in the most classical way that just the connection is lost, but in far more subtle ways, where we start losing the perfect timing that we do have in face-to-face interaction. So the video is a little slower, perhaps, than the audio, and then the audio picks up. And we notice these things, and they clearly come into the way of allowing us to comprehend what the other person is saying.
Definitely. Well, Gabriella, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights on this topic. This sounds like phenomenal work that you're doing in the lab. And I know it is fraught with challenges, as is everything in science. I think many of us have had these days where it just feels like everything is going wrong. So do you have an experience that you can tell us about where you really struggled with something, or maybe you had a major failure that you were able to eventually work through? And if so, how did you?
I don't know about major failures, and I totally readily understand and agree that I must be in denial here. Yeah, but it's certainly the case that becoming more senior has not protected me from struggling with multiple rejections, for example, of papers and especially of grants, or from struggling from imposter syndrome, both of which are things with me constantly. And I understand I'm not unique in this respect. So many other colleagues also have similar feelings. I think I do not have any special way to get over these feelings. Certainly putting some distance with the rejections or thinking about past successes certainly help. But in general, for me, it has also been helpful to think that life is not only defined by my lab. I have a great kid who is also very successful. And this helps in shifting to a more positive outlook when I need, so that then I can move on and resubmit the paper or take a deep breath and resubmit the grant. So there's also another thing that I'd like to mention that is perhaps one important lesson I have learned in life is that we need to be flexible and be able to adapt, as we actually never know what life is going to throw at us. And therefore, it's so important to remain open and ready to modify plans in our life and in our research. So in my life, sometimes I had unexpected, fantastic opportunity, but also a fair share of unexpected difficulties, as when I found myself as a single mother when my son was 3 weeks old, or when a few years later I had a major health scare. So these were times in which has been critical for me to be flexible and to have a network of friends, including indeed many people I work with from around the world who really helped me to stay sane and afloat and move on.
Definitely. I think this support network is so important for all these different elements of your life. Like you said, it's not just the science sometimes that's causing you trouble. There are health concerns, there are family issues that you might be experiencing. So I think it is critical to develop and maintain that support network to get you through the tough times, Gabriella. But we don't just want to focus on these difficult moments in your life and your science. I'd love to talk about the successes as well. So do you have a favorite success story that you can share with me and our listeners today?
So I really, really like to celebrate the small and big successes of all of my early career lab members. And I run a relatively big size lab with undergrad research assistants, MSc students, PhD students, and postdocs. And just yesterday, we heard that the paper presentation for one of the major international child language conferences that has been written by one of my undergraduate students received the prize for best abstract. This is a very hard conference to get into, and an undergraduate student in my lab received the prize. This is something really for me important to celebrate. Also, the week before, one of my postdocs was offered a lectureship. I always make sure that I do celebrate these successes, which are so much at the core of really enjoying being part of my lab family. Pre-COVID, I would bring cake at our meetings every time we had one of these successes. Now, unfortunately, all celebration has gone virtual, and I'm afraid I'm putting forward too many rain checks for cake later on. But there you go. Hopefully, from September onward, we're going to have a lot of cake to celebrate new and old successes.
Oh, that is phenomenal. Well, congratulations to the undergraduate, of course, and the postdoc as well for this lectureship. So what were you thinking or feeling when you got these phenomenal pieces of news?
I was so proud of her, incredibly proud of her, incredibly proud of how much she changed in the years she worked in the lab, from being an incredibly smart student to becoming someone who can do actual scientific research and not only write about it in a very professional manner.
That is wonderful. Well, a big congratulations to you in the lab. And I'm sure you've got a lot of makeup cake waiting for you guys when you're able to get back together again.
Oh, yes.
And I think it is so important to celebrate all of these successes. And I think postponing them has been a challenge. And I think postponing travel has been another thing that's been a challenge over the past year or two here in science, because a lot of these conferences have been canceled or moved to virtual formats. But when you were able to travel, I think this is a great part of life as a scientist. So do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you, Gabriella, whether it was a conference, training opportunity, or working with colleagues?
I've been to Japan many, many years ago. A delegation from UCL went to visit the site of the NTT company in Kyoto. And then after that visit, I went on to visit a colleague in Kobe. And it is memorable to me because it was the first time visiting of an Eastern country. And to me, it was absolutely fascinating staying in a ryokan that is a traditional Japanese accommodation just outside Kyoto and experience traditional Japanese food, which I absolutely love, and go to the public bath. Then in general, both in Kyoto and Kobe, I found the architectural contrast between the West and the East striking with, for example, a temple right next to a Western-like shopping mall. And it was really interesting to see. And this happened to me in particular in Kobe. In the street often approached me with a smile on, welcoming the opportunity to practice their English.
Oh, wow.
That was fascinating.
Did you teach them some Italian while you were at it?
I did try. I definitely did try. And that was the time in which Japan was, for some reason, just going mad for tiramisu.
Interesting.
It was really interesting for me to see and how they changed the ingredients to make it possible in Japan, where in fact dairy is not such a common thing in many dishes. It was really, really interesting. Now, these days meaning pre-COVID days, my favorite trip has been to visit my colleagues at the Moss Rehabilitation Research Center in Philadelphia. I've been there so many times now, but I always look forward to the next trip, which is now been sadly postponed. I just love the size and the buzz in Philly. I simply find it to be a really welcoming and fun place to be.
Well, it sounds like you've had some wonderful experiences traveling for your work and, of course, working with colleagues there in Philadelphia. And I think this is one of the wonderful aspects of life as a scientist, is being able to connect with people all over the world. And I think the people that you work with are one of the other things that really make science unique and make science a fun career. So there's a lot of stereotypes out there, Gabriella, about scientists. I'm sure we're all aware of them as being sort of these nerdy, very serious, always working, really solo players in the field. And I think that is just not the case in so many people that I've met in science. These people are creative, fun, welcoming. So do you have an example of maybe a quirky tradition or just an experience or a memory that you've had with colleagues that really showcases this human side of science that I think people don't often get to see?
We don't have any quirky traditions in the lab, but our tradition is to go for lab walks.
Ooh.
Exploring different parts of Greater London. And we go twice a year, around Christmas and then in the summer. We usually leave sometimes in the morning or early afternoon, and we end in the evening. And we plan the route more or less so that we can walk across parks, woods, and fields. And with much care, we plan our endpoint because it has to be some gastropub in a new place around town. Now, this has been a lovely tradition throughout the years, but of course, England is not the warmest and in particular sunniest place on Earth. So we've had to switch gears from time to time, in which case nowadays what we do is to plan and visit a museum or part of a museum, and then to have an international potluck at my place.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I think a great way to get the lab together outside of the building, get people some fresh air and introduce some new conversation topics, perhaps. What's perhaps been maybe one of your favorite memories from one of these walks? Or do you have an example of something unexpected that came up along the way?
One really fun memory has been just before the walk for Christmas 2019. We were nearly on our way for the walk and it started raining. so badly that we had to change plan. And we discovered right there and then that the boyfriend of one of my PhD students is an archaeology major who loves Roman history. So there we went to the British Museum, and he gave us an outstanding guided tour of some of the Roman history rooms in the museum. And it was so fascinating.
Oh, that's so cool. I think it's fun, too, to be learning new things about your lab members and their families and people close to them as well. So
absolutely.
It sounds like a great tradition, and I hope it can continue for you in the lab soon. We've talked about some of the great work that you're doing there with your team in the lab, but I know, Gabriella, often things keep you from answering your dream research questions, whether it's funding, staff, technology, limitations and feasibility, whatever it might be. If we took away those barriers that you normally face, is there one research question that you would want to answer most?
Well, if you take everything away, then it'll be time travel, of course. But next in line to me is really to understand how the human brain has evolved to develop our ability to be social, intelligent beings that culminate in our ability to communicate and use communication for learning and for cooperation.
Interesting. I think the time machine would be useful for that as well, right?
Yeah, the time machine would be incredibly useful for so many things and so many people.
Well, Gabriella, I love it. Thank you so much for dreaming big with us on the program. And we've covered a lot of topics. I'd love to end with advice for our listeners out there. So is there one piece of advice perhaps that you received at some point during your career that you found really helpful and you can pass on to our listeners today?
Merrill Garrett always used to tell me just to follow my nose. And I think this is a beautiful piece of advice, is don't follow what is trendy. Don't follow what people tell you should be doing, but just follow whatever it is that strongly motivates you, the question that you really want to answer, because you're going to be so much more motivated to answer it. And also, it will bring you perhaps at the borders of knowledge more closely than following instead what's fashionable at the time. So I'm glad I did follow his advice. And I think I pretty much followed it throughout my career.
Oh, that is wonderful advice out there for our listeners. So listeners, follow your nose. Don't get stuck on those trendy hot topics in science. I think, like you had mentioned, the things that you are most curious about will help you stay focused and passionate about your research as you go through your career. So wonderful advice. Is there any other last piece of advice from you personally, or maybe a last note of motivation or inspiration that you'd like to end our conversation on today, Gabriella?
Uta Fritt, who's a colleague at UCL, at some point when I was struggling with my small baby and trying to juggle all the things that I had to do, she offered me a piece of practical advice that I would love to pass on to all new parents who are struggling, trying to juggle between their work and looking after the children. That is, don't be afraid of putting all of your money in good quality childcare. It really pays back because you'll feel more relieved when you're working because you know that your child is in good hands. And, you know, in this way, you can work and then enjoy the remaining time that you have with your children.
Certainly. Well, Gabriella, thank you for sharing that piece of advice. I know this issue of balancing work and family is so tough for a lot of scientists out there and people outside of science as well. So excellent advice. Wonderful note to end on. If our listeners want to get to know you better or want to know more about your research, what is the best way for them to reach out or to learn more?
So I can be easily contacted by email at g.vigliocco@ucl.ac.uk. You can learn more about me and my research on my website, which is www.language-cognition-lab.org. Or you can follow me on Twitter at UC Language Lab, all one word.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Gabriella on Twitter. Check out her lab website and definitely don't be shy about reaching out via email if you have any questions. Gabriella, we appreciate you joining us today to share your stories and your expertise. Thank you again so much for your time.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's been wonderful to have you here, and listeners, always great to have you with us as well. I hope you'll join us for our next episode of People Behind the Science.